Okay, so this is going to be a whirlwind session, and we're talking about easements and management plans and stewardship generally. And again, based on the conversation yesterday morning, we're coming at this conversation because some of the best way to engage landowners are in that first conversation that you have if somebody's coming to you with a possible easement donation, or if you're looking at acquired easements through any number of programs, right? So it's both what are the opportunities to engage? What are the opportunities to think about soil health as you are putting together an easement, to the extent that you have any flexibility in those easement deed terms? Same thing. Is there value to having a management plan? I know that many of you have management plans. I just want to remind you to look at the poll questions, because that will help us all see sort of who uses what kind of management plans. And we know that in this world, as we are increasingly, land trusts and public agencies are under pressure and increasingly interested in trying to support greater conservation outcomes from permanently protected land. So that this is an evolving area. We're thinking about, how do we use easement language? How do we use management plans to promote public health, to promote soil health, not public health? And what are the ways that we can also think about stacked conservation? So underlying easements plus a management plan plus overlay easements, or other ways that might provide some of that financial support to producers and landowners. So I know that 45 minutes is not nearly enough. We cut back this session to allow more time for our producer panel this afternoon. We want to have a longer session around management plans, and we will find a way to do that at some point this year, and would hope that our panelists can come back to do that. But again, this conversation is thinking about easement language, the pros and cons of thinking about soil health and practices in an easement versus thinking about how do you use a management plan to encourage soil health building practices, and what are the various ways that land trusts and public agencies are doing this kind of work. So we have four great panelists here that I want to introduce. And they are Allison Volk, who is AFT's Deputy Director for Land Projects. She's based in Madison, Wisconsin. She coordinates all aspects of our new easement acquisitions. And prior to that, she worked for the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection for 10 years, managing and overseeing that state's farmland preservation program. Laura Hayes is also with AFT. She is our stewardship manager. She's formerly an NRCS conservation planner, and Laura now drafts a bunch of our management plans, particularly in the increased number of projects that we are doing that are by protect sell projects. We are really pleased to be joined by two folks from the Iowa-based White Rock Conservancy. Carissa Shoemaker is Director of Stewardship for the White Rock Conservancy. Tyler Bruck is White Rock's Land Program Manager. And we're excited to have them here, and we invited them because White Rock is pioneering the use of what they call a soil health conservation easement. This is the first time they've joined our training to talk about it and their approach. We're really appreciative, Carissa and Tyler, and you guys taking the time to be with us and talk about it. So we're just going to run this. We don't have any slides. Nobody has any slides. This is an informal conversation. And toward the end, I'm also hoping that I can look to Eric Kingfisher with Jefferson Land Trust, who's a participant in this training, because we know that Jefferson is a land trust that is purposefully including soil health in their management plan for easements, and would love to have him talk just a minute or two about that. about that approach. But I'm going to start, Allison, with you, and wondering if you can tell us a little bit about AFT's approach to encouraging conservation as part of either a donation or an acquired easement, and particularly how prescriptive or not is the AFT easement deed language around conservation generally and soil health specifically. And if it's not, why isn't it?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sure can.
So AFT in the past couple of years we've started kind of looking at how we can try to increase conservation practice adoption on protected land. And, you know, we've been trying to incorporate these conversations with landowners as we begin the easement donation and the acquisition process. So, you know, we're trying to kind of capture information in the landowner's interest as we're, you know, going through those initial conversations. Our hope and our approach, especially as we're sort of just kind of new to this work in some ways, is to be as collaborative as we can with landowners, you know, to try to gauge their interest and, you know, hopefully, you know, help them to see the benefits of adopting a lot of these practices on their property. In our actual easement documents, we're not prescriptive about the actual practices that we want to see landowners implement on their property. Instead, what we're doing is we're making reference to an agricultural practices management plan, and we're requiring landowners to follow that plan. So the easement language, it kind of lays out the framework of what we'd like to see in the plan itself, and then we rely on the plan to really guide the practices that are happening on the ground. You know, our worry about being too prescriptive within the easement is, you know, being able to enforce those terms over time, and, you know, the understanding that kind of things change as time goes on. And so we want to have a guidance document that's able to be flexible and revisited as circumstances change, as landowners change, as an operation changes.
Great, thanks so much. That's helpful. Let's go to Carissa, because White Rock has pioneered this new easement template. Super exciting that you are calling a soil health conservation easement. And when we talked about it, you said this is relatively new, so since 2021. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this programming, sort of how this initiative came to be, how many easements you've done, and what the easement particularly requires in terms of soil health?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Good. Awesome. So White Rock Conservancy, like Chris mentioned up top, is a land trust. So we're a pretty classic land trust to start in that we have physical boundaries. We manage about 5,500 acres in west central Iowa. And we, so we're new to easements, and this all came to be. It fits under our mission statement and under our umbrella, because in addition to conservation across our land, we also are involved in recreation and then also sustainable agriculture. And one of the central tenets in our sustainable ag program is soil health, and both promoting mitigation of erosion and improvement of soil health. So it's always been core to what we do. But we hadn't really reached outside of our physical boundaries before until we had the opportunity to do so when the Garst family in Iowa was looking to preserve their conservation legacy on their farm ground that they were selling. They were selling just short of 2,000 acres in 2021, as Chris mentioned. And they had seen farm ground in the past get tilled under, even if they made handshake deals with the new landowners to continue their practices of no-till or cover crops or whatever they had in place. They had people just till it under, and they saw a lot of erosion after the fact, and they wanted this land that they had been stewarding for decades. I mean, since the 70s at least. They'd been no-till since the 80s. They wanted to preserve that if they could, and they decided to pursue easements as that answer, as one answer, one management strategy, but that would ensure that that followed the land and not the owner, and had these central tenets that they could rely on. So they were looking for someone to hold those easements, and they asked White Rock and they asked Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation if either of us would want to hold them. And we have a very close relationship too with INHF, and we ended up stepping up to the plate in this new adventure. And like Chris mentioned, we were branding these soil health easements. That was what the Garst family developed them as. They actually worked with a lawyer in collaboration with us, but they were spearheading the development of that template. And they worked with a team of soil health experts and practitioners to come up with this fairly loose document. It says, it establishes up front that soil health is one of the main purposes, but also some of the main purposes are preserving scenic and open views, which is typical of conservation easements. It also mentions water quality, but it definitely emphasizes mitigation of erosion and improvement of soil health. So that's stated up top in the purpose of the document. And then there are also permitted and prohibited uses articulated in the document. And some are fairly specific, counter to what Allison was saying in terms of their strategy. Some are fairly specific, like minimizing disturbance, and disturbance is mostly called out as tillage. So they do prescribe no-till unless you get permission from White Rock. And then they also say that you have to have continuous living roots in the ground, whether that's row crop and cover crop, or whether that's prairie, or whether that's timber. It's very loose about what you have on the landscape, as long as there's something growing or in the ground year round. So that's one of the central tenets too, which aligns with the soil health principles. It has some language in there about livestock, about how they're encouraged, but that CAFOs aren't encouraged. And that was actually just because the Garst family was passionate about that. They didn't want CAFOs on their land. There are certain rules about if you are farming, when you can terminate your cover crop and that sort of stuff. And then it also talks about how landowners are supposed to share data with White Rock to help with our monitoring, to help supplement the data that we collect, and how we will be out there doing soil testing and sampling too. And specifically mentions aggregate stability as a test that we use, but it leaves it pretty open to how we're going to assess the soil there. So that's the main, in a nutshell, that's what the easement says. There are other things in there, of course, that I think Tyler's going to hit on later, but those are the main things with soil health. And we started out with the sale of the Garst land. We started out with just short of, like I said, 2,000 acres, and that was broken into 9 different easements with 8 different landowners. So they put up the land for auction, and we had educational webinars ahead of the auction explaining what the easement was, making sure that people knew exactly what they were getting into, and people actually got a chance during those webinars to weigh in on different parts of the easement and to ask questions that then resulted in us revising the documents. So yeah, out of that we got 9 easements across 4 counties, and then we just wrapped up an easement in another county, so now we have easements across 5 counties just a month or 2 ago, and that put us at about 2,100 acres more or less that we now monitor and manage through our easement program. We're working to grow very slowly because there's a lot of groundwork yet to lay, and we're excited to be here today to also learn from folks who are doing these land management plans, because that's something that we're looking at adding to our easements.
Great. Thanks so much, Carissa. That's really interesting. Can you just talk a minute? So, because we talked about this when we talked earlier about the experience so these were easements that you have negotiated and with the Garsts, and then this land was sold with an easement, but before that it was there was an opportunity for landowners or prospective buyers to kind of weigh in on things. Can you talk about what the reaction has been, and when these properties went to auction with these easements, what the concerns were? Was it generally, were folks interested? Who were the ultimate buyers? What was the reaction to thinking about buying a piece of land with this type of easement on it?
Yeah, I think that the reaction or reception that we heard or had was milder than we expected frankly, because we were expecting all but one of these farms was in row crop with maybe some hay ground. One of them was freshly planted to CRP to prairie. But for especially the farm ground, we figured there might be some pushback because farmers are used to making their own decisions on their own land, and having an easement that's dictating not exactly what you farm, but kind of dictating how you farm. The other thing that relates to that is that every time they have any project that disrupts the soil, they need written permission from us. They have to request permission. And that's another thing that folks, just private landowners, aren't used to doing. Like, I don't ask permission before I plant a tree in my yard or or anything like
Right.
that. So I think folks were a little bit, they weren't as vocal about that as I expected or as we expected, but they did ask questions about it. They wanted to know exactly what it would look like on the ground to have that sort of partner in monitoring and managing their land. And they also were really curious and maybe a little apprehensive about some of the particulars, like what exactly constitutes tillage. Some of them were like, well, so I use strip tillage and I use this particular machine, and how is it causing more disturbance than knifing and manure, which is allowed in the easement. So there were just these nuances specific to farming operations that people wanted to piece through. Or they were asking, like, is anhydrous ammonia permitted, or is it just organic fertilizers? There were just a lot of details. They're a very detail-oriented crowd. And then, yeah, I think we just got really good questions during that, those Q&As. And then in terms of the ultimate buyers, there were a lot of big buyers that were interested, but we think ultimately they were interested in the discount more than actually having farm ground with an easement on it, because the successful bidders ended up being locals. We had mostly local owner operators, with the exception of two families who were 30 minutes and an hour away, who hired or who lease out the ground now or have a farm manager, but still relatively local, small entities. A lot of the local owner operators, it just made sense to get the ground in their system. They have nearby farm ground that they can easily tack on. A lot of them had experience with cover crop, but not all of them. And then one of the buyers was interested in these easements. They specifically wanted to practice conservation, and they hadn't previously done that on any ground before. So that's what we ended up with, yeah. And the total discount, there was still a discount. The average discount across all the easements was 24%, from the appraised value without an easement to the appraised value with an easement. So that was still something that they experienced, but.
Great. That's really helpful. So let's go on to talk about management plans. And I haven't looked at the polls yet, but I'm guessing that every single entity who is involved in this training has a different approach to management plans, right? Some plans or like the FRPP easements that you hold have a requirement for a conservation plan for highly erodible land. Ditto for some of the ASEP AL easements that you may hold. Some of those also, there was a point in time when ASEP required ALE management plans themselves. So, and then as far as easement donations, a number of other programs, you could have multiple different management plans, whether that's for timber or for grassland or for nutrient management. So this whole wading into this whole world of management plans gets very complicated very quickly. But I wanted to go to you, Laura, to talk a little bit as AFT. Allison referred to the fact that we use management plans particularly to sort of guide and have a collaborative approach with landowners in terms of achieving conservation objectives. And I'm wondering, Laura, if you can talk a little bit, particularly as we've evolved our thinking around conservation objectives, and particularly around soil health, sort of what goes into an AFT management plan and how we are addressing soil health in those plans.
Sure. So what I've done is I created a template that focuses on NRCS priority resource concerns for the state that the farm is in. Since we're a nationwide land trust, we work in all states across the country. So the priority resource concerns can vary a little bit. They're usually pretty standard. There's always going to be soil health in the resource concerns because it's NRCS. And if it wasn't, I still always include the principles of soil health and recommendations about, maximizing biodiversity, maximizing cover. I'm sure you all know the principles of soil health. And also what I do, because we're nationwide, I might not be able to be on every farm that I'm writing a management plan for. So I developed a questionnaire that we send out to the farmers before we write the management plan to ask about their current state of management, to give me an idea of what practices they're already using. And then I draft the management plan from there. So we've been really lucky. We have really eager landowners who are asking for management plans, and I'm finding oftentimes that many of our farmers are already doing a lot of the things that I would recommend. So the plans are not overly prescriptive because most of the time they're doing the things I would recommend, as I said. And our plans don't focus just on soil health. They're more holistic. So there's a section about forest management, and maybe the recommendation is just seek a licensed forester to write you a forest management plan, but we're hitting on every resource concern that NRCS has identified for that state. I also think using the questionnaire helps it be more of a collaborative effort with the farmer. I ask what their goals are, what their priorities are before I write the management plan, because I don't feel like it's not a great approach to just have AFT come in and say, this is exactly what you need to be doing. It needs to be a collaborative effort. And yeah, so we talk about everything from water resources to IPM to plant health. So to me, all of those things are still addressing soil health, right? You might not think that a forest management plan addresses soil health, but it does. So all things sort of circle back to soil health, but they are our plans are separated into sections, soil health being the first, and then all the way down to water resources, pest management, things like that.
Great, thanks. So it's interesting because as we talk about management plans, and again, knowing that you all, or probably most of you all, require some kind of management plans, the more, and the idea of whether it's language in an easement or it's a management plan is a way, not only as you sort of subsequently do stewardship visits, but engage with sort of subsequent owners of protected land, a way to continue to keep the conversation going. And so, and being able to come back and talk about a management plan and continue to engage with landowners around what their conservation objectives are or what their farming objectives are is still very valuable. But as these management plans, like in thinking about the stewardship front, and Tyler, this way I now look at you for your thoughts on this, because the stewardship responsibilities and the more that's either in an easement or in a management plan that perhaps a landowner is required to implement, that stewardship responsibility gets more complex. And I'm just curious from White Rock's perspective, since this is the major part of your job, is walk us through what kind of monitoring your easements are requiring and how White Rock is thinking about the capacity you might need in the future as this programming expands.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Chris. We're excited to share on our program. So our easement program is a lot different than a normal, conservation easement in many ways. And that definitely shows when it comes time to monitor. So, and this plays in a lot to, looking into the future on, how we are going to manage easements down the road, as we get more and more of them. So right now we try to do a site visit or monitoring visit 3 times minimum. And that's because there are so many things that we need to monitor. So we'll maybe start out in the fall after harvest, looking for any erosion areas, maybe checking that cover crop has been seeded. We might follow that monitoring visit up in the spring to look at cover crop emergence. And then even as Carissa mentioned, checking to see when that cover crop was terminated. In our lease, we have that you cannot terminate more than 14 days ahead of planting your row crop. Obviously, the longer that cover crop can stay, the more benefit the soil gets from it. So, right there, you're 3 to 4 site visits, and you're monitoring several different things each time. And then, you have to take that information, bring it back, document it. Maybe the producer didn't get their cover crop on in time. So I'll have to go back and do, maybe an infringement letter or email, document the situation. So there's a lot of admin work there too. It's a lot more involved, I think, than what we anticipated starting out this program. There's some kinks we will work out to become more efficient, but there are a lot of things that we, with the soil health aspect, are looking at. And as Allison kind of talked about before, practices change, and Carissa mentioned this too. The easement is written that we will change as farm practices change. So we're flexible in that way. And we kind of rely on that too. An example would be kind of going by the NRCS standards with a cover crop seeding rate. That's something that we kind of let fall on their standards. So, and we'll use that as our, seeding rate. Same goes for the deadline for cover crop establishment in the fall. There's a deadline to which, they don't recommend planting after. So it helps on our end, to fall back on agencies like that with that type of provision. Same could be said with, the DNR on any type of maybe timber plan or anything like that. So I guess taking that further as we, look at capacity into the future, again, I don't think we really knew what that was going to look like on the easement monitoring side of things and the time that it would take. And, as we reach out further, originally we thought, well, maybe we'll be within a half-hour radius of White Rock. Well, as Carissa mentioned, we are happy about the new easement in western Iowa. We're working with the landowner in eastern Iowa. So now we're stretched an hour and a half one way and almost 3 hours to the east. So there'll be some burden with, and some constraints as far as what we can manage that way, but definitely a work in progress.
Great. And you talked about, or I think Carissa talked about sharing data. What are you asking landowners to do any particular type of soil health assessment or soil testing? Are you doing that and sharing those results with them? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, if the landowner wants to, do any of the soil health testing data, they're more than welcome to. But our easement does require that we monitor soil health. And as Carissa mentioned, we right now are doing a soil aggregate test once a year to help kind of track our soil health data. We took baseline samples when we took on the easement. So from that point, forward, we can track and hopefully see, the soil improve. If it was to decline for some reason, that's when we can fall back on some other farm data that we can request at any time. And that's anything from spraying records to, seeding rates of corn and soybeans. Obviously, the planting and termination of cover crops are a big one. So we do ask for any and all farm data to kind of help us piece together the puzzle if we do see a decline in soil health.
Okay, great, very helpful. So I see what time it is. Oh, actually, Tyler, if you or Carissa could speak to one last thing. You talked about how at the beginning that you've done most of this, that this is done through easement language, and that you were sort of interested in thinking about how a management plan would fit into this equation. And what is your thinking on what that would look like?
I can take that, and maybe Tyler can chip in. So we have a couple different examples of where we thought a management plan would be prudent. One related to what Tyler was saying about the cover crops is simply asking people or collaboratively working on a plan for seeding. What are you going to plant? When are you going to plant it? How are you going to plant it? What's your seeding rate? Especially for these farmers who are newer to cover crop, I think that would have been helpful last season because we did have some different practices. We advised drilling, for example, but a couple people broadcast it instead, and they didn't have successful germination. And I think we had a pretty dry fall, so that's probably why. The easement does permit that, but it says if moisture allows, if conditions allow. But if we had had a management plan for that, I think it would have been easier to really emphasize that drilling would have been more successful. There is also habitat on some of these easements that we could use a management plan for. We have, one of them actually has a grove of timber that specifically in the easement it says you must preserve this for monarch roosting because monarchs pass through there. But it doesn't really dictate how. It just says basically you can't cut the timber down. But it doesn't really say like how do you maintain the health of the trees. It doesn't talk about nectaring or foraging, like nectaring habitat for the monarchs either, which is also important. So theoretically, they could mow the whole understory. So we were thinking, in retrospect, it would have been nice to have a management plan for that and something that we could work now collaboratively with that landowner on, and then also maybe point him to some cost share opportunities to help in case he wants to improve that habitat even. And then Tyler's also, just the last example here quick, he's also working with that new landowner on a grazing management plan. If you want to talk about that quickly, Tyler.
Yeah, so with the new easement we have, there's an opportunity for a producer to put some cows on the land, which we definitely promote. And so, that's a good instance of, getting together with the landowner, coming up with that plan. And it was kind of written in the easement that way that, this area is open to, farming or grazing. We would just sit down with the new landowner and come up with that plan. Because there's some kind of critical areas that we want to protect and that are protected in the easement. So just getting together with the landowner, coming up with a plan, I think will be huge for us moving forward. And on that same property, the easement protects a wooded area. And kind of the same provisions apply there that, the new landowner in White Rock will come together and form a management plan, for that particular area.
Yeah, and that's just to reaffirm, Tyler mentioned that's in the easement. We put that in that easement. That was that new easement where we had the opportunity to be like, what would we have changed? We didn't get too crazy, but we did change a few things just based on our monitoring and our relationship with the landowners so far. And we did just sneak in a little, you're going to have to establish a plan with us on these sensitive areas.
Right. Interesting. Well, it's great. So thank you. Thank you guys for being willing to share that with us. It sounds like it's still evolving. It'll be really interesting to see what you learn going forward, and then how we can help or be supportive in all the folks in the participants here who all have a variety of management plans. So again, we're going to have a further conversation. Would love to have you guys back to talk further. I do want to give a couple of minutes to Eric Kingfisher with Jefferson Land Trust. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, Eric was one of the kind souls who agreed to be part of our advisory committee as we were putting this curriculum for the training together. And Jefferson is a land trust that does use management plans and thinks and talks with landowners specifically about soil health as part of that management plan. So Eric, if you are willing, would love you to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about your approach to soil health in management plans.
Yeah, sure enough. Thanks, everybody. As a land trust up here in Washington State, we do lots of different kinds of conservation work, and Farmland's one of those kinds of conservation work we do. And we've taken to including in our conservation easements language that is a sort of shall language. It's language that says we shall be putting together stewardship plans to accommodate or sort of support the conservation easements. And I'm happy to share that, that language if that would be helpful. We put that in the purpose statement, that stewardships in the purpose section, the stewardship plans can be developed for this or will be developed for this conservation easement. And the way we structure our stewardship plans is that we try to draft a stewardship plan at the time of the conservation easement. So when we're negotiating the terms of the conservation easement, we're kind of getting towards closing. Then I actually go down and sit down with the landowner and work through the stewardship plan. And the way we basically structure these things, and I think this is where hopefully this is helpful for everybody, is when we look at conservation easements, we typically have in the beginning the recitals that somewhere in there you're describing the conservation values that are being protected by your conservation easement. In these cases, we're talking about agricultural conservation easements, let's say for the purpose of soil health conversation here. Agricultural conservation easement may say something like, okay, some of the conservation values might be agricultural productivity, the prime, unique, or important agricultural soils of regional or statewide importance, or existing potential economic productivity, or the viability of the site for continued agricultural production, including farm and market access, blah, 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 water management. These different, not water management, but these are different conservation values that could be described in an agricultural conservation easement. So when I go to sit down with the landowner, I say, okay, hey, here we go. We're almost at closing of this conservation easement. So exciting. Now let's put together the stewardship plan that's described here in section 3.12 or whatever. And here are the conservation values we're saying we're going to be protecting with this conservation easement. So let's talk about the way you're managing your farm. Like what are the ways in which you are managing your farm that are helping ensure that the agricultural productivity is going to be maintained and sustained over time? And or how is a prime and unique and important agricultural soils are they being maintained, and how can we ensure their soil health is being honored and established for future generations? And when I ask the landowner that, or for the farmer operator that, it opens up a nice long conversation about the different practices they employ. And what I'm doing with my stewardship plan development is getting on the same page with them about what it is they're doing now and anything they might need to do differently to accommodate for the actual permanent conditions of this conservation easement that are being established. And so what we do is we identify the different threats to these conservation values as a way to think about them. So agricultural productivity, or so we're talking about soil health here. What are some of the threats that could impact the soil health? And we bring up erosion, we bring up some kind of exploitation or overproduction, and not really giving back to the soil, not having a really reciprocal operation. We identify the different ways in which they're doing things right now, or they will be doing things that will reduce the chance of those threats actually causing an impact. And so we draft in objectives to say, okay, so you're going to be sowing cover crops in the fall to stabilize soil through the wet winter months to prevent rain-induced erosion, or something like that, so that we're actually putting in soil health practices as objectives in the stewardship plan that are meant to ensure that the conservation values are being maintained and honored over time. Hope that makes sense, but essentially these stewardship plans then become the really the main thing that I use in my annual monitoring. Is like, hey, what's the latest? Let's go through the stewardship plan. What's the latest with this cover crop situation? Or another objective might be keep the amount of bare soil to a minimum. I'm seeing some bare soil over here. Looks like got a lot of livestock over here for a while. What's going on with that? And I have something to point to, something that's conversation we've already had. And then if and when that land sells, then within 90 days of the next landowner acquiring the property, we sit down and do that same thing again. And we can make changes to these stewardship plans too. If they decide to change their operation, they got some new ways of doing things. We sit down and figure that out. But it's typically a sit down, let's talk about it over coffee kind of thing.
Great.
That's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And we really don't have time. I see what time it is. But I am curious. It does seem like I'm looking at the polls. It does seem like quite a lot of you do use management plans. It was exciting to see that so many of you are already helping when you're talking to landowners. When you're monitoring easements, that some of you are already sort of well plugged into how to help them identify sort of technical and financial resources. So that is great to see. It's also really nice to see that some of you are already using the Federal Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, to help producers on protected land access some of those NRCS financial assistance programs. So it seems like, Eric, it's wonderful to sort of get your sort of nuts and bolts about how you use that management plan to promote those conversations. That's what we hope that everybody can do, whether that's through management plans, conservation plans, a little bit through easements, as White Rock is doing. We need to close. If people do have questions, I've been looking at the polls, so I haven't seen it. Let me pause before I say thank you to give people a chance to ask a question. If we have one or two, we could probably take one or two. So Mary, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was, I noticed that the White Rock Land Conservancy had they look at the soil test results and see what's going wrong if they are looking like they're declining. And Eric mentioned that there were certain targets in the management plan for practices. And I'm curious to know whether in the easements is monitoring and enforcement and compliance really focused on practices, or are there any easements that people use or any management goals that people use that specifically require the landowner to meet a certain quantitative goal in terms of their soil health? So like, are they required to do practices, or are they required to meet an outcome, or both?
Ours are both at the moment. And I think, again, it's under development. Even getting to the point where we had a recommended soil test took months and months of deliberation, going with the aggregate stability test over Haney, over any number of tests. So yeah, right now ours definitely prescribe practices. And if, for instance, they till up their whole field without getting written permission from us, that is technically an infringement upon the tenets of the easement or the provisions of the easement. But there is also that safeguard, that net that Tyler was talking about, where especially if best management practices change over time, if we see the soil health going down, we don't set that bar other than that baseline sample that we took. We took a baseline sample across the farm and then also a sample in the margin of each field that shows like a stable point that's not disturbed. If we see a decline, then it basically just leaves it open for some sort of change in management practices. So let's say they are adhering to all of the practices we prescribe, but their soil is also deteriorating, then I think it leaves us open to exploring other ways to further enrich the land. Like for instance, right now it doesn't say that you have to have more than one type of cover crop. They could just plant rye. So maybe then we say, hey, let's come up with a plan together to diversify. Maybe we also add livestock. There is a gray area though, because technically I think our easements wouldn't punish them for soil health declining if they're doing everything right. So it's more of a negotiation and just trying to see what you can do together at that point.
Great, thanks. Diana had a question, but I can't see it. So Beth, can you read the question? I think it's directed at Eric.
Absolutely. It says, Eric, does your stewardship fee reflect the additional staff time and costs of creating these plans and monitoring? And how do you handle when a landowner pushes back on the components of the plan?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to answer it this way. So when we do our stewardship plan, the first one, we're doing it as the project is coming to a close, or when we're actually acquiring that conservation easement. And typically those costs, my time of doing that work to put together the plan and other staff's time, is incorporated in the overall project cost. So if there's grants associated with this, we're using those grant sources sometimes to help, cover some of those initial costs, like creating a baseline conditions report. We also have a stewardship plan cost that comes out of the project itself, and so we have to find that money somewhere for that initial draft or the initial stewardship plan, and then that plan may last anywhere from maybe just a couple, 2-3 years until the property goes into other hands, but it typically lasts longer, like 5 or 6 or even 10 or more years. And after about 10 years, I want to revisit it anyway. So we are in our stewardship contribution estimate. So when we say stewardship fee, we're talking about with conservation easements for all of you. We have a policy, or typically land trusts ensure that there's some sort of stewardship funding that's coming along with each acquisition of a conservation easement that goes into some kind of stewardship fund, and that can be arranged in lots of different ways, whether it's a fee or some sort of a donation or any number of different things. And we calculate that based on really what are we committing to, how much time every year is it going to cost to just do our annual monitoring, and also with the potential for there to be some sort of enforcement necessary for this conservation easement. What are those costs, and how do we interpret that? So we have to have a number coming in, and I do incorporate in my estimates, how often there might be a landowner change on a particular property based on the condition or what my best available information I have. That helps me determine really how much more time I'm going to need to refresh that stewardship plan, totally rewrite, refresh, or whatever. And so I do weave those in. And if I ever have any landowner who pushes back on the components of the plan, then they haven't read the easement. I mean, the easement is the guiding document on this, and the easement is the authority. And so if there's somebody who says, hey, I don't like this about soil health or something, then we're gonna have to have another cup of coffee. I mean, it's gonna take more time to work that out, and it can come in a lot of different directions, because landowners typically are there voluntarily. They establish the easement, they know what's going on, or they bought the property, they know what's going on. There's a conservation easement, they read it, they know what they're doing. But the trickiest ones are sometimes when the property becomes owned by somebody else through a bequest or something like that, and they're just trying to figure out like what's going on here and why would I have to do it this way, and it just takes longer to get them up to speed. But there's not a lot of room to work with anybody if they say, I would rather exploit this property for its and degrade its conservation values, which include the soil quality, because I'll make more money. And then we say, well, that's sorry that you don't have the rights to do that anymore. That's not actually a condition of this property anymore. That's why the land trust is involved. And so we just have to have those conversations. And if they keep pushing, then we just have to get attorneys involved and push back on it that way.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Eric, especially to you, because I threw this at you this morning to ask you to join. So I'm really grateful that you were willing to jump right in and share some thinking from your land trust. So Carissa and Tyler, thank you so much for coming on and sharing the White Rock perspective and this exciting new work of yours. Allison and Laura, it is always helpful to have your insights and expertise. So thank you very much. And again, understand that this was just scraping the surface of this conversation, and we need to do a lot more in the kind of management plan conversation. So we will figure out a way to do that further on in this year as we are all together. So with that, thank you very much.